Good afternoon and good evening if you are joining us from across the Atlantic, or I guess it's still the afternoon if you are in the West Coast. I am Magda Tedder and I'm the Schindler Chair in Judaic Studies here in Fordham, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our first of over a dozen events we have planned for you this semester, and our first installment of this year's lecture series on Black Studies and Jewish Studies in Conversation. If you have joined us before, if you joined us last semester for the 4 previous talks, you will know that each unit of this series brings together 2 scholars whose intellectual homes are one in Jewish studies and another whose intellectual home is in Black studies. And I'm grateful to all the scholars who have agreed to take part in it. As I myself know, it is not easy to come out of our own comfort zones to engage with scholars in other fields and to learn something new about our own. In the past lectures in this series, we've heard about fluidity of racial and religious categories in the Caribbean and the United States, or as Laura Liebman put it, on being Black and Jewish in early America. Then we've heard about Ethiopian Hebrew congregation in Harlem, discussed by Judith Weisenfeld and Jenna Weissman-Joslit. And then Wes Alsenat and Derek Penzler discussed searching for Zion, exploring parallels between Haiti and as a refuge for Black people and Zionism as a quest for Jewish homeland. And the last lecture in this series was Eli Rosenblatt in conversation with Belinda Edmondson about Creole ambivalence in Suriname and other parts of the Caribbean. Today, we will welcome Ben Ratskoff, who will speak on Du Bois before the Warsaw Ghetto. That's a reference to Du Bois's famous essay from speech from 1952, and he will be joined by Amelia Glaser. Bennett was a member of the planning committee, along with Wes Alsenat, Eli Rosenblatt, and myself, who made this series a reality. And I'm really grateful to him and very excited to hear his talk today. So let me introduce our speakers today. And then before I hand it over, I'll let you know what's coming up next in our series. So Ben Ratskoff is currently a visiting assistant professor at the Lauchheim School of Judaic Studies at Hebrew Union College and the University of Southern California. He completed his dissertation, Waltzing with Hitler, Black Writers, the Third Reich, and Demonic Grounds of Comparison, 1936-1940, at UCLA just last June. His writing has appeared in Jewish Studies Quarterly, Studies in American Jewish Literature, as well as in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Truth Out, and the Jewish Currents. Amelia Glaser holds an endowed chair in Judaic Studies at the University of California in San Diego, where she teaches in the Russian and Comparative Literature Department. Professor Glaser is the author of Jews and Ukrainians in Russia's Literary Borderlands, and her most recent book that just came out in 2020, Songs in Dark Times, Yiddish Poetry of Struggle from Scottsboro to Palestine, won the 2021 Jordan Schnitzer Prize in Literature and Linguistics from the Association for Jewish Studies. She's also the editor of Stories of Khmelnytsky, Competing Literary Legacies of the 1648 Ukrainian Cossack Uprising, which came out of Stanford in 2015, and with Stephen Lee, Comintern Aesthetic, which came out of the University of Toronto Press. She's currently the Lita E. Hauser Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, where she's working on a book about Ukrainian poets and translators since the 2013-2014 Euromaidan revolution. As I promised, before I hand over the screen to Ben, I wanted to share with you our next event and give my thanks to those who made these events possible. So our next event is on February 2nd, also on Wednesday, February 2nd, so exactly a week next week, sorry. is our Fordham NYPL lecture series in Jewish studies. And we will hear from Sharon Weltman about Elizabeth Pollock, Jewish Emancipation and the Archive of 19th Century Melodrama. And this is in honoring the fellowship program and highlighting the works of the fellows that the Fordham NYPL program in Jewish studies, a fellowship program highlights. I will send the registration links in the chat and information about other events. Now I would like to express my thanks to all of you for joining us, but also to our partner, Leo Baeck Institute, for co-presenting this event. Leo Baeck Institute has been a terrific partner. We've co-presented events together, including one last semester. So I am really delighted to have them back today as well. Today's event and all our events would not be possible without Siobhan Verletza, who has made sure that you received the links for today's lecture and has taken care of all the logistics for today's and other events. And none of the programs would be possible without your generosity, support, and interest. And I'm grateful to the Knapp Family Foundation, the Pickett Family Foundation, Eugene Schwidler for their support, and to so many of you in the audience who have, for your generosity and for enabling us to bring these terrific programs to you. So now, without further ado, I would like to turn the screen over to Ben Ratskoff, who will start his talk about W.E.B. Du Bois. Thank you. Unmute.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Magda. I first of all wanted to thank Magda, Wes, Eli, and Siobhan for organizing the series, inviting me to participate in it. And thank you to Amelia for so generously engaging with my work. I'm going to now share my screen and hopefully start a presentation. Okay. So what I'm going to share is a portion from a chapter from my dissertation, which on the whole focused on how Black writers represented Nazism and the Third Reich in real time. This chapter in particular focuses on Du Bois's writing from the Third Reich during his 4-month visit in 1936, and tries to draw out some of the differences between his writing then and his much more well-known writing on the Holocaust from after the war. So the way that I'm going to sort of structure this talk, or the way that it'll move, is I'm going to kind of move backwards. I'm going to start by framing the talk through Du Bois's sort of famous essay, The Negro in the Warsaw Ghetto, move back to a key moment when his trip to Germany was covered in the German-American press, and caused somewhat of a PR crisis with the American Jewish community, or excuse me, the American Jewish Committee, and then finally dive into the columns themselves from Germany. So to start, on April 16th, 1952, the communist monthly magazine Jewish Life hosted a tribute to the Warsaw Ghetto Fighters event, at which W.E.B. Du Bois was invited to reflect on his visit to the remains of the Warsaw Ghetto 3 years earlier in 1949. The text of the address was published in the May issue of the magazine with the title, The Negro and the Warsaw Ghetto, and you can see that here. The managing editors of Jewish Life had already, since 1947, commissioned articles from Du Bois on quote, Black Jewish relations, unquote, and the relationship between the struggle against anti-Semitism and the struggle against what they named, quote, anti-Negroism, end quote. In his address at the event in 1952, Du Bois recounted his 3 visits to Poland over some 60 years and admitted that his post-war visit to Warsaw in particular resulted in not so much clearer understanding of the Jewish problem in the world as, quote, a more complete understanding of the Negro problem, end quote. He continued, quote, the ghetto of Warsaw helped me to emerge from a certain social provincialism, into a broader conception of what the fight against race segregation, religious discrimination, and the oppression by wealth had to become, end quote. Notably, Du Bois did not use the term racism here to link anti-Jewish and anti-Black violence, instead highlighting the international combination of various regimes of race, religion, and capital. Nonetheless, his visit to Warsaw stabilized a conception of the race problem that transcended the color line and recognized Black and Jewish experiences as commensurable. He concluded by warning, quote, "We are facing war, taxation, hate, and cowardice, and particularly increasing division of aim and opinion within our own groups. Negroes are dividing by social classes and selling their souls to those who want, and colonialism in order to become part of the ruling plutarchy. Among Jews, there is the same dichotomy and inner strife. All this should lead both these groups and others to reassess and reformulate the problems of our day, whose solution belongs to no one group," end quote. At the same time, contemporary political and sociological discourses were solidifying an ascendant racism concept that easily grouped together anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness. In an indictment of Nazi Germany and its race science, UNESCO issued its landmark 1950 statement on the race question, which instructively defined racism as, quote, "at once a creed and an emotional attitude, the outcome of a fundamentally anti-rational system of thought. It thrives on scientifically false ideas, nourished by ignorance," end quote. Racism, therefore, appears as ideological and pathological deviance, the result of regressive, irrational thinking and ignorance. Naturally, UNESCO's international campaign would use, quote, "the methods of education, science, and culture to wage the battle against all forms of racism," end quote. This racism concept and its attention to psychological and educational defect enabled an analogical frame in which anti-Jewish and anti-Black violence became forms or expressions of individual prejudice. That same year, American Jewish sociologist Morris Janowitz and Austrian Jewish psychologist and refugee Bruno Bettelheim published The Dynamics of Prejudice, a study of anti-Semitic and anti-Black attitudes among veterans. They acknowledged the sharp differences in anti-Semitic and anti-Black stereotypes, but attributed both to a, quote, "oppressive superego," end quote. As Sander Gilman and James Thomas explain, quote, "the cause of both was identical. Its expression was different," end quote. Janowitz and Bettelheim's solution, predictably, was educational rehabilitation. Just 4 years after UNESCO's statement and Janowitz and Bettelheim's book, Gordon W. Allport would publish his best-selling classic, The Nature of Prejudice, providing a general theory of what he called anti-outgroup attitudes. It should be noted that all of these publications formulating a generalized racism and race prejudice concept also followed the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, which in the wake of Nazism had defined the crime of genocide in non-political terms as the intentional destruction of human groups abstractly defined, whether national, ethnic, racial, or religious. Du Bois's writing on Nazism from before the war, however, does not anticipate the comparative perspective of his post-war address and does not lay the groundwork for the seamless integration of and analogy between anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness evident in the post-war formulations. Du Bois spent 4 months in the Third Reich in 1936, during which he wrote weekly columns for the Pittsburgh Courier. The trip was part of a world tour Du Bois embarked on from June to December 1936, traveling through Germany, the Soviet Union, Japan, and China. Whereas Du Bois in 1952 wrote that his post-war visit to Warsaw resulted in a more, quote, "complete understanding of the Negro problem," end quote. In his newspaper correspondence from Germany in 1936, he struggled to arrive at such a stable and integrated understanding. And there is no conceptual unit in Du Bois's post-war columns, such as racism, that unites German anti-Semitism and US anti-Blackness as such. The closest approximation is race prejudice, yet that concept ultimately fails to stabilize an analogical relationship between them. In exchange for settlement and completion, the 1936 columns offers a partial account. to borrow Tina Kemp's term, tracing various possibilities of articulation and disjuncture as Du Bois considered what he called the American Negro problem from within Nazi Germany. And you could see here, in addition to his column, a postcard that he had purchased during his trip in the summer of 1936. On January 29th, 1937, New York City's Stadtzeitung und Herald, a historic German-American newspaper founded by immigrants a century earlier, editorialized an interview with Du Bois headlined Farbiger bereist Nazi Deutschland, Man of Color Tours Nazi Germany. Just below this headline, the deck added, Professor Du Bois of Atlanta on the Jews in the Reich. And the poll quote clarified, their situation lamentable, but not to be compared with that of the Negroes, end quote. Du Bois had just returned from a global journey that took him, as I mentioned, across the world before returning to the mainland United States. While the article's actual discussion of Jews in Germany was buried in its final 2 paragraphs, the editor's deck and pull quote reflect an agenda that sought to minimize similarities between the 2 cases. In the body of the article, the anti-comparative assertion in the pull quote was repeated, ambiguously expanded, and tenuously supported with very few and brief quotations from Du Bois. Quote, this is the way that the German newspaper is paraphrasing here. The treatment of Negroes, as Dr. Du Bois expressed himself, shows still no trace of race hatred. And the attitude of the German press during the Olympic Games was altogether thoroughly fair to the colored athletes, indeed friendly. But the attitude toward the Jews, Dr. Du Bois can simply not understand. The situation of the Jews is, as he said, very deplorable, but it does not admit of comparison with the situation of Negroes in the United States, end quote. This conclusion then dubiously emphasized in Du Bois's name the difference between the lawful persecution against Jews in Germany and the flagrant violation of law represented by anti-Black violence in the United States. Returning to the particular question of anti-Blackness in Germany, the article ended by reminding readers that Du Bois, quote, himself was received in Germany in a very friendly way and had to suffer no kind of racial prejudice, end quote. Now, in response to this article, Dr. Leo Stein of the American Jewish Committee wrote to Walter White of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, inquiring about the contents of the reported interview. He requested a full text of the interview itself for, quote, and this is Stein, although everything may be all right, some of his statements sound not quite clear, but perhaps the reporter may not have rendered exactly the words of Dr. Du Bois, end quote. Interestingly, Dr. Du Bois wrote to Stein on February 23rd, explaining that he had neither seen the interview in the Stadtzeitung nor the text the reporter submitted. Stein subsequently sent a copy of the interview to Du Bois and asked him to verify its reporting. And there is something unsettling, if I had more time, I would talk about this kind of up and back that happens and this insistence that Du Bois clarify his words. But finally, in reply, Du Bois did clarify to Stein the statements reported in the Stadtzeitung, navigating with sophistication, a comparison that, to his mind, required balancing sameness and difference. He wrote, quote, answering your letter of March 2nd, I beg to say that it is extremely difficult to express an opinion about Germany today, which is true in all respects, without numerous modifications and explanations. I am convinced that without doubt, the mob rule and illegal aggression practiced upon Jews in the earlier days of the Nazi movement was very grave and equaled in some cases the aggression upon Negroes in the United States. But the point I was trying to make in my interview in New York was that while I was in Germany, the Nazis had so changed the laws that practically anything they did to Jews was legal. And what you had was legal oppression rather than the illegal cast and lynching of Negroes in the United States. On the other hand, the difference between these two methods is not essential, but it does make direct comparison between the plight of the Negroes and the Jews in Germany difficult and in many respects misleading. Of course, I was not at all deceived by the attitude of Germany toward me and the very few Negroes who happened to be visiting there. Theoretically, their attitude toward Negroes is just as bad toward Jews, and if there were any number of Negroes in Germany, would be expressed in the same way. But the point that interested me was that while this is the theoretical attitude, there was on the part of the populace no natural reaction of prejudice toward Negroes while there was such reaction toward Jews, end quote. So Du Bois began with an unequivocal reflection on his real-time observations, framing their inevitable partiality and considering Nazism a dynamic historical movement that shifted its methods over time. He complicated an initial comparative frame of measure and equivalence, right? So at the beginning, he'd said it does, the cases do equal each other in some cases, right? But then he complicates this by introducing distinctions between the role of anti-Blackness in Nazi racial doctrines and the social and historical conditions in which such racialization actually manifests in practice. Du Bois thus carefully resisted any kind of direct analogy between anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism, disorganizing any conception of a globally systematic and stable racial hierarchy. Yet, evident in the final line, Du Bois did remain intrigued by the localized relationality of Blacks and Jews as racialized subjects. The subject matter of the columns he had written for the Courier, both before and during his trip in Germany, was really wide-ranging and eclectic. Du Bois dispersed and serialized a broad set of discussions that weaved national and international history with contemporary politics, analyses of economic planning with theoretical observations on racial identity and organization, and critiques of socialism, democracy, and fascism with his professional and leisurely experiences in Germany, including his visits to the Berlin Olympics, the German Museum of Science and Technology, a Wagner opera in Bayreuth, and the Siemens factory and its industrial school. The official purpose of Du Bois's journey, as described in the proposal Du Bois submitted for a grant and aid from the Oberländer Trust, was to examine industrial education in Germany in order to apply successful German methods to Black American schools in the United States. But at the same time, and as he wrote in the February 22nd column before his trip in late spring, no people in the world, quote, have the interest in the Jewish problem in Germany that the American Negroes have. It reorients the whole attitude of the modern world toward race problems, end quote. So that was his statement before he had traveled to Germany. The 1936 columns necessarily elaborated comparisons to anti-Semitism, fascism, and Nazism in real time and without rear-view knowledge of the Holocaust as a discrete historical atrocity. And in their form as serialized columns, they failed to produce a definitive analysis. Instead, they elaborated an ambivalent and mercurial comparative analysis across time, one that remained constitutively provisional and fractional. As such, the columns transgress the analogical alignments that became conventional in post-war discourse, organizing Blacks and Jews, whites and Aryans, and white supremacy and Nazism into commensurable columns of victim, perpetrator, and expression of race prejudice or racism. Excavating alternative comparative schemas that require a non-deterministic approach, the columns rehearse various relations across anti-Black and anti-Semitic regimes of race, while maintaining each's incommensurability. By incommensurability, I do not mean to suggest a possessive identitarian emphasis on rupture over relation. Rather, as Nathalie Melas theorizes, incommensurability can name the space between a ground for comparison and a basis of equivalence, providing the very possibility of relation, especially relation, as Du Bois attempted to articulate, across multiple unevenly intersecting regimes of race. Over 2 columns published in October 1936, Du Bois detailed his August visit to the town of Bayreuth in northern Bavaria. He described it as a shrine built around the name and memory of one man, Richard Wagner. Such an impression was no doubt compounded by the fact that Du Bois's visit coincided with the annual Bayreuth Wagner Festival. And these are images from that festival in the 1930s. And so, of course, the Nazification of the festival and Wagner's role in Nazism would have been overwhelmingly obvious. Bayreuth was long a right-wing and Nazi stronghold, and Hitler himself made annual summer visits. Yet, instead of going on to disclose Wagner's role in German and then Nazi nationalism, Du Bois in the column threaded the Bavarian city itself into an international axis of racial theory. He wrote, quote, "On the corner of Liszt Street, where I live, is the house where Franz Liszt, the master, died. At the corner of Von Fried Street, where I daily turn toward town, I pass the former house of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who, writing in German, did more perhaps than anyone to establish in Germany the theory of Nordic superiority," end quote. Immediately following, Du Bois exclaims, Wagner's, quote, "Wagner's fancies were of the highest importance for music and the modern world," end quote. So Du Bois mapped his experience of the city by memorializing its historical amalgamation of cultural and racial invention. Pointing to both the master composer Franz Liszt and the master theorist of German racial superiority, Houston Chamberlain, Du Bois invoked the invocation of German national splendor with international lines of race making. And we must also note here that Chamberlain was married to Liszt's granddaughter and Wagner's daughter, Eva. So we might even suggest that Du Bois's subtle work in the column anticipates some of the concerns expressed by Paul Celan and others about the complicity of German high culture in racial violence. But Du Bois's admiration of Wagner in the column was typical of Du Bois's attraction to Wagner and German culture in general, traceable to his early years as a student at the University of Berlin. In his 1903 text, The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois's short experimental fiction titled Of the Coming of John introduced Wagner's opera Lohengrin both in the plot and as intertext. Rather serendipitously, during the summer of Du Bois's 1936 trip to Bayreuth, the festival had selected Lohengrin as one of its performances, and Du Bois attended on August 19th. You could see his ticket here, as well as an image of Hitler's own attendance at the Lohengrin performance. In the October 31st column for the Courier, in which he described his experience in Bayreuth, he asserted that he knew the opera, quote, "by long acquaintance. I have heard it 6 or 8 times under many circumstances in different languages and lands. It rises to a great and glorious drama, which at times reaches the sublime." The columns, and I suppose I should also mention here and show here, right, that this is especially striking given that the Nazi propaganda had already, as you can see here, depicted Hitler himself as a knight in the image of the knight Lohengrin himself, right? So you see that here. So there was this collapse, so to speak, of Wagner's narrative with Nazi ideology. But the column's smooth transition from Bayreuth's unavoidable urban cartography of German nationalism and race-making to Du Bois's warm reception of its opera do represent the contingency and paradox of his experience of Nazi Germany. Okay, in the next column, he shifted from Bayreuth to Nuremberg and repeated his attention to ambivalent urban memory. He wrote, "You can walk in a castle that was old when Shakespeare wrote Hamlet and thread narrow streets which heard the earliest echoes of the far-off African slave trade," end quote. So these columns also implicated sites of German national culture in ideological and material geographies of racial supremacy and dispossession. Yet such geographies, both in the Wagner column and in the one on Nuremberg, did not produce a direct comparison of anti-Semitic and anti-Black ideologies and practices, instead suggesting their thick historical relation in international racial theory. On December 5th, 1936, the Courier published the first of Du Bois's uncensored columns from Germany. So these were columns sent to the Courier immediately following his departure from Germany and arrival in Poland. In the first, Du Bois began by announcing, quote, "I have written already a word here and there about minor aspects of the German scene. I am sure my friends have understood my hesitations and reticence. It simply wasn't safe to attempt anything further," end quote. He continued, quote, "Even my mail, when Mrs. Du Bois sent me a minor receipt to sign, was open to see if money was being smuggled in," end quote. These details cast doubt on his previously serialized remarks about Germany from August onward, characterizing them as partial and oblique. And they perhaps suggest his earlier subtlety, reticent to directly articulate the contributions of Wagner and the Bayreuth Opera Festival to Nazi anti-Semitism. But Du Bois then added, quote, "This does not mean that I have not enjoyed my 5 and more months in Germany. I have. I have been treated with uniform courtesy and consideration. It would have been impossible for me to have spent a similarly long time in any part of the United States without some, if not frequent, cases of personal insult or discrimination. I cannot record a single instance here," end quote. These comments do not suffice for a definitive assessment of anti-Blackness in the Third Reich, at best evidencing the Third Reich's incoherent and unsystematic execution of an anti-Black policy. They do, however, confirm that Du Bois's experience in Germany posed perplexing contradictions that complicate attempts to assimilate the Third Reich into a systematic and coherent framework of white world supremacy. And race itself does not appear central in Du Bois's understanding of the development of Nazism in the December uncensored columns. His December 5th column narrated the political and economic background to Hitler's rise without mentioning anti-Semitism, Jews, or race at all. He outlined a historical timeline of war, the Treaty of Versailles, inflation, depression, and revolution. And he emphasized the economic guilt imposed by the capitalist victors of the First World War. Detailing the extent of dispossession and expropriation, Du Bois described an international system of material deprivation and financial debt that spawned a revolutionary crisis internal to the Weimar Republic. He did ultimately, however, mention the present, quote, "campaign of race prejudice against all non-Nordic races, but specifically against the Jew," end quote. The December 12th column clarified Du Bois's understanding of the Nazi state and the question of mass German consent. He admitted that, quote, "Hitler set up a tyranny," but added that, quote, "he showed Germany a way out when most Germans saw nothing but impenetrable mist," end quote. The demystifying solutions worth sacrificing their liberties for involved employment, housing, insurance, and, quote, "an end of strikes and labor troubles, new ideals, a new state, a new race," end quote. Race here appears as an identitarian category of national resurrection. Du Bois added, when, quote, "capital made desperate effort to save German capital investment, they sought to build a national German socialism to avoid international working class movements and to save capital and private profit by yielding enough to the German worker to keep him quiet and satisfied," end quote. Du Bois recognized here how the racial nationalism of Nazism's redistributive solutions functioned as a detour around working class internationalism, intimating rather shrewdly National Socialism's early roots in the German Bohemian synthesis of nationalism and anti-Marxist socialism. Yet Du Bois's narration also paralleled an argument he made in his 1935 magnum opus Black Reconstruction, right? So this is being published just 1 year before he is writing from Germany. In a chapter titled Counter-Revolution of Property, Du Bois argued, quote, "the efforts at reform, one by one, began to go down before a new philosophy, which represented understanding between the planters and poor whites. Race repulsion, race hate, and race pride were increased by every subtle method." Interestingly, Du Bois named the cross-class racial unity that would resurrect the defeated South a, quote, "new philosophy." He continued, "There has arisen in the South an exploitation of labor unparalleled in modern times, with a government in which all pretense at party alignment or regard for universal suffrage is given up. The dictatorship of capital in the South is complete," end quote. This suggestive allusion to the official Comintern theory of fascism characterized the post-Reconstruction South as a proto-fascist regime. Du Bois distilled how a new philosophy of race united poor whites and planters to dismantle Reconstruction's reforms, effectively retrieving the relations of subjugation and exclusion that emancipation had ostensibly leveled. In the December 12, 1936 column from Germany, Du Bois directly duplicated this language by titling the philosophy of Hitlerism as the new philosophy, and outlined a commensurable process in which this racializing philosophy showed Germans a way out of labor troubles. While Du Bois did not compare the content of racial doctrines, he traced corresponding patterns of economic reform and racial reaction that suggest a comparable function. He explained that the new philosophy of Germany required, quote, a dictatorship that was absolutely necessary to put the state in order. If democratic forms persisted, this dictatorship might get in the hands of the workers, end quote. The philosophy was, quote, based on the old German idea of the state. The interests of the capitalist and worker are one, end quote, right? So it's this sort of unity of the German capitalist and the German worker that is quite comparable to the unity between the planter and the poor white in his narration of Reconstruction. Du Bois both attributed Nazism, therefore, to a German history of political theory, and also, by foregrounding the identity of interest between German capitalist and German worker, echoed his description of poor white and planter unity in the US South. In doing so, he emphasized the necessarily local ideological determinations of fascist nationalism, while also tracing parallel international patterns. Du Bois's difficulty comparing anti-Semitism in the Third Reich and anti-Blackness in the US is most explicit in his column published on December 19th. The column begins with a discussion of race prejudice in Germany, in which Du Bois clearly struggled to understand the commensurability of anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism as particular forms of, quote, race prejudice. The analysis reflected a tension between, on the one hand, the undeniably international context in which local economic contradictions parallel and interrelate, and on the other, the historical autonomy of race as a factor of local power relations and political identity. Du Bois stated unequivocally, quote, there is race prejudice in Germany and a regular planned propaganda to increase it and make it characteristic of the Third Reich, end quote. Yet he continued to qualify the statement in ambiguous ways, quote, but it is not instinctive prejudice, except in the case of Jews, and not altogether there. I mean that German prejudice is not the result of long belief backed by child teaching and outward insignia like color or hair. It is a reasoned prejudice or an economic fear, end quote. Du Bois's writing here is remarkably tortured and opaque, straining for and against some lexical unit that would stabilize and organize his comparison. More instructive than discerning a hidden order is the imprecision itself, equivocating between race prejudice as a generalizable category uniting oppressions across various nations and race prejudice as a locally and historically determined set of relations. Du Bois did not conjure a coherent system of white world supremacy that would uniformly organize anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism into stable, interrelated roles. And he did not unite white supremacy in the United States and Nazism in Germany as commensurate regimes of race. In the rest of the column's first section, Du Bois did in fact describe his muted experience of prejudice as a Black man, only to contrast this description in the following section on anti-Semitism. He wrote, quote, in the case of Negroes, race prejudice does not show itself readily. I have complete civic freedom and public courtesy. Of course, if my appearance is pronounced, I shall be an object of curiosity and even excited attention, end quote. Certainly, Du Bois may overreach here, aligning his individual experience as an American academic with the case of Black people in Germany at large, including, for example, former colonial subjects and Black German children hounded as Rhineland bastards. Yet his reported experience nonetheless indicated that the Nazi regime did not simply mirror or extend the United States' racializing hierarchies and relations. Nazi anti-Semitism did not represent a simple augmentation of racial oppression at a global scale. Du Bois made this point unequivocally as he proceeded to a discussion of anti-Semitism itself. He began, in the case of Jews, one meets something different, which an American Negro does not readily understand. Prejudice against Jews in Germany comes nearer being instinctive than color prejudice, end quote. Not only did Du Bois distinguish the instinctive German prejudice against Jews from color prejudice against Blacks, he also asserted that this form of prejudice was not easily grasped from the Black American viewpoint. He continued, for many centuries, Germans have disliked Jews, but the reasons had varied and are not at all analogous to white dislike of Blacks in America. Describing the unwieldy accumulation of multiple anti-Jewish ideologies in Germany, Du Bois stated squarely that such magnitude and variety could find no correspondence in the historical production of anti-Blackness in the United States. This assertion of incommensurability did not represent an entirely new turn in Du Bois's thinking. In his notebook from his student years in Berlin in the late 19th century, he made a similar argument with respect to the differences between Black American and German Jewish oppression. But what is notable in the 1936 column is Du Bois's attempt to modulate them together under the heading of prejudice, implying some ground of comparison, before denying any basis of equivalence, right, through this assertion that they're not at all analogous. The instability of the term prejudice in Du Bois's columns before it would achieve keyword status in the post-war era registers precisely that which of anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism the term cannot contain, that which exceeds generalizing analogies between them. When Du Bois explained the not at all analogous reasons for German anti-Semitism, he mixed a sweeping history of Christian Europe with specific observations from firsthand journey, foregrounding both its historical determination and local expression. Du Bois argued, quote, economic reasons built on a foundation of religion and clan solidarity are the real explanation. In the Middle Age, strangers who did not believe in Christ were largely excluded from landholding and work as artisans or shopkeepers, and found a way to make a living in the new commerce and moneylending. I have seen the old Judengasse in Frankfurt, where the Rothschilds, Schiffs, and other great capitalists were caged up of nights in narrow quarters, lest they contaminate Christians, and where they laid the foundations of wealth and power despite insult and oppression, end quote. Du Bois's comments on the communal accumulation of Jewish wealth and power dovetailed with his push for Black American consumers cooperatives in his previous Courier columns. And a consistent reader of Du Bois's columns in the Courier would have learned both. Du Bois here oriented anti-Semitism within a millennial history of Christian exclusion, sedimented over time by economic and racial segregation. Oh no, that's right, sorry. Sedimented over time by economic and racial segregation until it was recruited to shape Nazi ideology. Situated in a long and particular history of anti-Jewish governance in Christendom, Nazism would have been difficult to translate to the history of Black people in the United States. Du Bois's geographic detail in the column, referring to the Frankfurt Judengasse, materialized and localized this history even further, emphasizing the distance between his readers and Germany, and consequently between their experience of race in the US and that of Jews in Germany. Du Bois did, however, also consider Nazi anti-Semitism in a more synchronic relation to anti-Blackness in the United States. He noted, quote, it is widely believed that the Jewish problem in Germany is already passing. Visitors to the Olympic Games are apt to have gotten that impression. They saw no Jewish oppression, just as Northern visitors to Mississippi saw no Negro oppression, end quote. Without analogizing Jewish and Black oppression per se, Du Bois did analogize the ways in which state spectacle and the domination of public space concealed both in the United States and Germany. The implied comparison between Berlin and Mississippi alluded to the proto-fascist character of the Jim Crow regime as he had in Black Reconstruction. He wrote, quote, an integral part of National Socialist policy was world war on Jews. The proof of this is incontrovertible, end quote. Illustrating an example from personal experience, he relayed the view from his window. Quote, a great red poster 7 feet high asking the German people to contribute to winter relief of the poor so that Germany will not sink to the level of the Jewish Bolshevist countries of the rest of the world, end quote. In this detail, Du Bois exposed the interrelated dynamics through which public marketing techniques and advances in media technology combined with statecraft to racialize both poverty and communism in mass political culture. Du Bois wrote, quote, Adolf Hitler hardly ever makes a speech today, and his speeches reach every corner of Germany by radio, newspaper placard, movie, and public announcement without blaming or cursing the Jews, end quote. The mention of a newspaper placard rather than a newspaper itself again draws attention to the modern dissemination of racializing propaganda through urban public space. Finally, Du Bois listed cases of discrimination he read in German newspapers over his stay in discrimination, including the carceral regulation of sexual intimacy, exclusion from public office, disenfranchisement and denaturalization, discrimination in education and trades, and consumer boycotts against Jews. And he concluded by denouncing, quote, the continued circulation of Julius Streicher's Stürmer, the most shameless, lying advocate of race hate in the world, not excluding Florida, end quote. Du Bois put newspaper circulation in Germany and the US South in synchronic relation, comparing each's circulation of racializing ideologies. Du Bois thus compared the function of newspaper circulation in the reproduction of regimes of race, rather than the discursive content of racial ideologies such as particularly anti-Black or anti-Semitic language and aesthetics. Du Bois's ambivalent approach to the synchronic comparison of regimes of race was to isolate structural patterns for comparison while maintaining the autonomy of anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism as locally developed and determined ideologies. The comparison is thus ever unstable, and to use Du Bois's phrase, not altogether there. It remains a horizon. Even the reference to Florida comes as a marginal footnote after an extensive and relatively detailed description of the present plight of the German Jew alone. Corresponding from international travel with the hopes of provoking Courier readers to consider the American Negro problem in the context of the modern world itself, the columns exposed, in contrast to the bulk of reporting on Nazi Germany and Black American periodicals in the period, how very unevident it was to relate anti-Blackness in the United States and anti-Semitism in Germany. Unlike at the remains of the Warsaw Ghetto, Du Bois left Germany with no more complete understanding of the, quote, Negro problem, end quote, but rather profound unsettlement. Such unsettlement is no mere dead end as a negation of comparison, rather as the real-time elaboration of, quote, a practice of comparison that doesn't begin from the foundation of empirical unities, end quote, and those are the words of Natalie Melas again. Du Bois's unsettlement of comparison is an inventive mode, generating multiple relational conceptions of fascism, race, anti-Blackness, and anti-Semitism that are otherwise occluded by analogical orthodoxies. Thank you.
So I'll jump in at this point, and I want to thank you so much, Ben, for this wonderful, stimulating talk. Your work is really exciting and incredibly important. Many will agree that Du Bois, in his long career, can be credited with opening a conversation about American racism, but the fact that he also wrote about German anti-Semitism is really significant to current conversations, I believe, about understanding the differences as well as possible connections between various forms of discrimination. So one of the big questions that I think Ben's work opens is how we might look to the 1930s to think about whether anti-Semitic race law in Germany, in Nazi Germany, can be usefully compared to American racism, despite their very different contexts. Ben's reading of race with the help of Du Bois is a factor of local power relations should help us to think about the complex intersection of ethnic prejudice, politics, and economics. So I want to try in my very brief comments to offer some ideas for probing more deeply into what Du Bois calls the German instinctive prejudice against Jews as something different from American anti-Blackness. Du Bois, my understanding is that Du Bois was in Germany in the 1890s as well as in the 1930s, and he views the country from the perspective of someone who is deeply critical of the US racism. As Ben has shown us, when he was there in the 1930s, he was struggling to reconcile what we can only imagine was a physically penetrable difference on the ground between the institutionalized anti-Semitism that had taken hold with Germany's new race laws and the grassroots forms of vigilante racism that were present in the Jim Crow South. So before delving into more questions for Ben, I've been asked to comment on just a little bit of my own work on Jewish writers who were describing lynchings in the American South as a kind of corollary to what Du Bois was witnessing in Germany. So I'll very briefly share my screen, and bear with me for one moment while I do that. Okay. screen the right size and in the right place. There we go. Can everyone can hopefully see that? Okay, excellent. So throughout the 1930s, we see a flourishing of Yiddish writing that is describing lynchings. And this is, we have to remember, exactly the same moment when Du Bois is in Germany, but a very different context. And what I've argued in my own recent book, Songs in Dark Times, is that Jews were very purposefully drawing symbolism and what I call in the book passwords from Jewish collective experience to describe other groups' struggles. So rather than splitting, which is what Du Bois is doing, as an academic is expected to do, they're lumping, as maybe poets are more expected to do. They're combining forms of oppression. So I wanted to begin by sharing this very brief section of a poem by Berish Weinstein titled Lynchings from 1936. And this is just the very end of a poem. He writes, I'll read it first in the Yiddish, Negel, niet auf dir bloß ist gefallen der Gürtel von Verlendung, a sach starben so wie du, a sa toit is itzt a modesa, a soi noch starben men, heint umetum, in Wedding, in der Leopoldstadt und in Carolina. Negro, the fate of destruction has befallen not only you, many die like you. Such a death is now in fashion. And so still dying, they now die everywhere. In Wedding, in Leopoldstadt, and in Carolina. Leopoldstadt and Wedding were two regions where there were pogroms during the early Nazi regime against both Jews and communists. And what Weinstein is doing here is applying these names as passphrases to connect anti-Jewish violence in Europe to the anti-Black violence that's taking place in the American South. And a great many Yiddish poems about lynchings were appearing in the 1930s, which were the early years of the Scottsboro trial in the United States. And it's worth just briefly saying a couple of things about the Scottsboro trial. In 1931, 9 young Black men were falsely accused of raping 2 white women on the rooftop of an Alabama freight train. And the trial, which began in 31 and lasted well over a decade, absorbed the American literary consciousness as well as the political consciousness and mobilized many Yiddish writers to start to describe the horrific racism they were seeing. It also compelled many Yiddish writers to think about lynchings as a form of pogrom and to try to encourage their readers to see lynchings as pogroms as well. And the party ended up mobilizing on behalf of the defense, on behalf of the Scottsboro 9. We actually see here, this is not, he was not a communist lawyer, but the Jewish lawyer, Samuel Leibovitz, together with the defendants at the Decatur jail. And then we see the defendants and the guards behind him. And so the Scottsboro trial became this polarizing event which split the left in the United States. And Du Bois, of course, as one of the founders of the NAACP, had a complicated relationship to the party's defense of the Scottsboro 9. He at first was saying, well, maybe the party, maybe letting them help to fund the defense isn't a bad idea. They'll help to mobilize support. But he ended up quite critical of the way that this was handled, and this drove a wedge between Du Bois and the party, at least temporarily. But of course, it was also this event that made Yiddish writers think more about how to equate this rise of Nazism in Germany with various forms of structural inequality in the United States. And I'll note that a number of activists at the time, including some key Black poets, referred to Scottsboro as an attempt at a legal lynching. So when Du Bois, one of the questions that I will have for Ben, when Du Bois talks about sort of legality versus illegality, I'd be curious to know more about how he reconciled that with what was going on in Scottsboro and the rhetoric around Scottsboro. So the Scottsboro trial was very much on people's minds when Du Bois was in Germany, and his own criticism of the party over Scottsboro certainly would have factored into his trying to reconcile the relationship between Nazi Germany and his own interest in the party as a possible antidote. So another question that I have for Ben for further consideration is how Du Bois's own relationship to this case might have influenced his language and his rhetoric around ethnic discrimination in Europe as well as in the US. The parties' involvement in the trial, of course, complicated the widespread association of Jews as well as African Americans with communism in the United States. And the fact that Leibowitz was the defense attorney for the Scottsboro Nine deepened this relationship. And moreover, as the trial proceeded in the United States, the Nazi Party was gaining power throughout the 1930s. Then, of course, we also have the Spanish Civil War breaking out in 1936 with the Italian and German fascists supporting the Francoist rebels against the democratically elected Spanish Republic. So the fact that Du Bois is trying to find language to talk about the difference between various manifestations of oppression and of fascism, I think is important at this time when many others were trying to find the similarities. Yiddish and English language writers alike, and again, my experience is largely with poets, it's primarily with poets, and by English language writers, I'm primarily thinking about Black American writers, were increasingly aware of the similarity between Nazi anti-Jewish legislation and the Alabama court system, which could be seen as institutionalizing a culture of pogroms and lynchings, respectively. So by the late 1930s, the Scottsboro boys were facing the very real prospect of legal lynchings. Clarence Norris was 19 at the time of his arrest. He was the first to be sentenced to death. His sentence was later commuted, but he was the oldest of the Scottsboro boys. He was convicted and sentenced to death by electric chair in 1938. And Langston Hughes, in his poem, August 19th, a poem for Clarence Norris, exposes a kind of parody between the lynch mobs that threatened the Scottsboro defendants and the court that would condemn them, really considering this as sort of legal lynching. For if you let the law kill me, Hughes writes, are you free? And Hughes is also frequently comparing the Scottsboro Nine, especially Norris, to Christ figures. This is something that Yiddish poets were doing in their discussion of anti-Semitism in Europe as well. So I'm going to stop my screen share. I have more poems that I'd be so happy to share, but I want to jump to more questions for Ben so that we can get into the general discussion. My first question involves the legality, this idea of the legality of racism, right? Legality with very, very heavy scare quotes around it. What strikes me as one of the really important interventions that Ben is making here is the discussion of legalized forms of racial or ethnic discrimination versus the illegal forms of lynch law. And I believe this discussion is especially relevant in light of discussions of policing as an unethical but systemic practice. So one question is a request to comment more on the implications of these very much in-process ideas for Du Bois in the 1930s about legality and the relevance of his thought process to our present conversations about systemic injustice. I'm also struck by Ben's attention to Du Bois's own ambivalence about the high halls of European culture, Wagner and so forth. Du Bois clearly enjoyed Wagner, while also calling attention, being uncomfortable with the deep-rooted systems of inequality that are on display in Wagnerian total art. So that is to say, it would seem that Du Bois's candid comments about the Third Reich are sort of early gestures toward a more in-depth analysis of deep-seated forms of oppression, whether in Europe or in the United States. And I'd be curious to know whether this writing from the 30s is later reassessed in his later works. And of course, he's writing here before the final solution in Germany. And also on the subject of Du Bois's relationship to German high culture, is the Third Reich that Du Bois witnesses a symptom for him of what Horkheimer and Adorno would later consider to be a danger of the Hegelian progression of rationalism toward the Hitler Youth? So put more simply, is high culture positive or negative for someone like Du Bois? And I realize that's a very simplistic way of putting it, but I'm curious to know more about the relationship between high culture and rationalism. And then finally, I've already touched on this, but the party, Du Bois, in addition to spending time in Germany, was in the Soviet Union, where Black Americans were held up as the victims of capitalism, whereas Jews were often viewed as complicit with capitalism. So I'm wondering whether Du Bois's views of Nazi Germany reflect his complicated relationship to the party and to the Soviet Union of the time. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there, allow you to comment a little bit further and to clarify further, and then we should move on to questions from the audience. Thank you again so much for this incredibly rich and smart talk that you've shared with us.
Thank you, Amelia, really for that engagement. I mean, a lot of really great questions, and I'll do my best to address them. Some of them, I'll say I think are just great points for me for further investigation. I think, so the early statement that when he's this, and it's in a private letter that's to Leo Stein of the American Jewish Committee, that he makes this distinction, right, between kind of illegal lynching and legal oppression. Now, if we think of in the context of 1936, right, so this is immediately, well, not immediately, but a year after the Nuremberg race laws, right, are imposed. And as historians like Doris Bergen and Claudia Koons and George Mossy all write, a big motivation of these laws was to clean up the rabble, so to speak, and formalize a system of oppression and not allow for so much street violence, especially, from the influence of Hermann Goering, who was trying to build much more of a law and order kind of respectable society. And I think that traveling to Germany in the wake of that, when before 1938, when there's sort of that, obviously there's a massive increase in sort of street level violence, there was a period of where kind of the violence by the SA and the SS was curtailed, that the law was supposed to do its job, so to speak, right? And it's possible that this distinction is that he's reflecting that moment, but I actually think what's more important is kind of and by the way, I mean, there's so many things that we could say about this. That's just, there were so many race laws in the United States, right? I mean, so it's like it's not quite clear to me, why doesn't he just talk about there's also legalized discrimination against Blacks in the law, right? But I think, I guess what I take out of that, because you're it's somewhat of a dead end, was it accurate, inaccurate, is that what he says there is that the difference between these methods is not essential at the end of the day, but it does make comparison difficult, right? And that's what I guess I take from that, right? Which is not so much whether or not it's an empirically accurate description, or he's making this, empirically accurate distinction, but rather he's simply suggesting that these methods are different. I mean, even lynching, right, has had a whole, particular culture around it based in the US South, which, on a very abstract level, we can and many have compared to pogroms. But when you zoom in, right, they're very different. They have different origins, right, et cetera. And so I think just that kind of reticence of saying, differences in method don't matter at the end of the day when you ask the victim, right? But they do make it difficult for us to just assume that the same exact thing is going on, right? And I guess that's what I take from it in that regard. The influence of Scottsboro, his position on Scottsboro, on his writing here, is a really tough question. I probably need to think about that more. I mean, I think it's really true and accurate. In the columns, and this maybe connects to sort of his, I'm going to try to answer this by connecting it to his Germanophilia, which has been written about quite a bit and is long. It's a long history of that. I mean, it goes all the way into the 1960s. I mean, he gave an interview in the 60s, and the reporter was sort of asking about all of his praise for Bismarck and Imperial Germany, and Du Bois sort of retorts, you have no idea what Louis XIV did to the Germans and trampled all over them, and the way they unified in the 19th century was amazing. And, so he sort of had this Germanophilia especially because he is thinking about, in the early period, in the 19th century when he's there, the fragmentation of the Black people, right? How to unify the Black people. And he's sort of very inspired by the romantic nationalism that was popular in Germany, which, brings us to Wagner, right? And that's the whole question around this love of Wagner, and this love of Lohengrin in particular, which was like, this sort of becomes this Hitler myth, is that, Lohengrin represented, I don't want to get into the whole plot of the opera at all, but, really represented this kind of national resurrection, and Wagner's nationalism itself was coming out of sort of the failures of 1848, right? And this sort of return to a kind of romantic nationalism away from this sort of the failure of kind of a democratic revolution. And there is this sense by Du Bois, I think, for a long time, not just in his early period, that kind of nationalist culture making has a role. And we even see that in the Pittsburgh Courier columns. He writes before he travels to Germany in the summer before, he says clearly that race hate is terrible and racial patriotism is terrible. But what he says is so fascinating is that passionate provincialism is the escape for many. That we cannot deny that building a kind of national culture and cohesion and unity is the way for many to escape oppression and subordination. And so ultimately at this stage, and he goes through many different phases around his political attitudes towards segregation, towards uplift, etc. But in this phase, in just the June of 1936, I believe, he was writing that we need the unity of a racial effort. We actually need racial segregation to solve our problems. We don't need to be making Black music for white entertainment. We need to be making it for Black people. We need to be building Black consumer power. But at the same time, we need to repudiate kind of all artificial racial superiority and understand that racial nationalism is sort of a step on the way to abolishing all races. So he sort of thought of it in kind of a pre-Sartre sort of way of this dialectic of the particular and the universal, right? But as a kind of way station towards a universal abolition of races. But he was not willing to kind of just, and this probably goes back to the Scottsboro, he wasn't willing to just sort of jump immediately on the internationalism train, right? And the way that connects to his Germanophilia is really quite complicated, but also interesting. So that, by way of a long answer, I think to come back to the Scottsboro question, right, I think is really key, is that he was suspicious of why are we going to have these white lawyers coming in, to defend these boys, right? We need to show Black strength as a community here, right? And now then you asked about how his views changed. His views on that certainly changed. Obviously, he eventually joined the Communist Party. His travel to the Soviet Union was key. I would also say on this trip, he travels to China, where he witnessed Japanese, or not just Japanese, but all kinds of oppression in China. He goes to Japan. He goes to Japan as well, and has a similar kind of strange admiration for the kind of nationalist culture that is being built there, this quasi-fascist Japanese imperialism.
Can I jump in? Sorry, yes. I want to jump in and ask you just a question building on something that you just said, because it strikes me as important and I want to hear your response to it. That is that when we talk about Jews and Blacks in American academia, what we're used to talking about is anti-Semitism and racism. Should we instead be talking about Du Bois and Jabotinsky? Should we instead be talking about nationalism with a small n, forms of early 20th century, national revival and revolution? It's an uncomfortable question for me to ask, but I feel like I need to ask it, especially when we're comparing forms of national particularism and internationalism, including communist internationalism.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I think that, and on both sides, meaning I think that there's plenty of work that needs to be done thinking about Black and Jewish internationalisms as well. But yes, right. I think that in this cauldron of kind of interwar nationalism, especially fascism, right, and the relationship, because Du Bois, as he wrote in the columns, I didn't speak to about it so much, but he really understands Germany and Italy and their subordinate position in Europe as sort of the cause of this kind of fascist reaction, right? And so there is this understanding that subordination can produce a sort of fascist response or reaction and this kind of nationalist tightening, so to speak, right? So I think that you're right. Like, I think that he opens us up to that. And I think that there are other writers as well. I mean, in other chapters of my dissertation, I talk about, for example, Black writers who were making comparisons between fascism and certain Black nationalist groups that they were concerned about or disagreed with. C.L.R. James, for example, in his article on Garvey, or Richard Wright and his statements on Garvey as well. So, and he even depicts it sort of in Native Son with Bigger Thomas kind of imagining this man who's going to give me race pride and give me meaning and purpose, right? Interestingly, when Bigger Thomas is why does he imagine that? He's looking at a newspaper of a Japanese general, right? And so that's sort of this idea that, oh, a person of color can be in power, right? So yes, absolutely. Like, I think that's part of what's constrained by our sort of fixed focus on, like, these are the victims, these are the perpetrators, this is the racism, right? And there's such a broad kind of political and uneven terrain of political formation and ideology at the moment, especially before fascism becomes taboo, right? Especially before the Holocaust happens. There are people who are engaging with it quite openly. So yes, so I hope, I know that was long-winded, but I hope I covered all of that in some way.
Thank you both. I will jump in with some questions. There were over 200 of you, so not the questions, but of you in attendance. So it was very well attended. We will not be able to get to all the questions, but we will convey them, comments and questions, to Ben and Amelia. People, of course, loved your talk, and so did I. You have addressed one of the questions about other Black intellectuals with whom Du Bois was in conversation during the time. So but the question was also, how did they react to his reporting from Germany? So I don't know whether you want to add, and then I'll just add one more question. Maybe we'll have another time for another one, but a question about related to the Du Bois' resistance to draw clear analogies between anti-Semitism and race hatred in the US, and even between the forms of race hatred at play in Nazi Germany and in the US. How do we interpret Du Bois's drawing of direct analogy between the condition of enslaved Black workers in the antebellum South and the condition of super-exploited non-white workers colonized by Europe and the United States around the globe? Conversely, in your estimation, what enables the latter analogy, and how should this influence our understanding of his resistance to analogy between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism? And that's, of course, in reference to the chapter on of work and wealth in the Black Reconstruction. So
yeah, so I'll just say quickly, I don't really know. I haven't been able to find specific reactions from other Black American or Black diasporic intellectuals to the columns themselves. And if anybody does, please do send them to me. I would be fascinated. The other question, I think that's really a good one. In the sense that I think it's raising sort of questions about where racial oppression within Europe and against, what we might call Europeans, okay, these, regardless of the way that they were so forcibly and violently expelled and exterminated, right, to non-Europeans, right? And so I certainly think that Du Bois, we can sense there's a lingering, before he gets to the Warsaw Ghetto, so to speak, and he kind of makes this statement about sort of transcending the color line, right? He is still operating with this idea of sort of a relatively homogeneously white European space against a world filled with people of color. However, I would note that in his columns in 1936, actually, he makes less generalized remarks about different groups around the world. So one of the most interesting columns that I didn't get to talk about is he sort of links together kind of white labor problems, anti-Semitism in Germany, and fear of yellow peril, right? And so those are all very like specific sort of moments, some of them racializing, some of them not, right? That he links to politics of reaction. So I think that that's to answer. I think that that's what could explain it. And I think that in ways it's telling. You know, I think that the question of whiteness, which I don't really go into, right, is a major one. And but I suppose in spite of this kind of assumption that it seems like Du Bois is having, I actually think that what his columns expose in many ways is really how it's not so easy to simply say, oh, Nazism kind of unwhitened Jews, right? That they racialize them, certainly, but there are many different ways to racialize people, right? And he wasn't just absorbing the Nazi system into a system of white supremacy. So maybe that.
And do you think that his comments then from 1953, after he visits Europe after the war, and especially Warsaw, that his comments about gaining clarity is sort of a reflection back on those essays that he's written at the moment that, you know, he didn't have clarity,
yeah,
in that way, the murder of Jews and where what he saw in the 30s led helped him see some clarity, or and do his views change?
Yeah,
after World War II.
Yeah, I mean, I think two things. I mean, on the one hand, I think the clarity is responding to all of his writing. I mean, he had written much more about Jews in the United States, all the way going back to the Souls of Black Folk. And even before that, I mean, his writings from his student years in Germany are really quite fascinating and complicated around, you know, the rise of German socialism and the place of anti-Semitism in German socialism. Mm-hmm. He is aware of it, and he's somewhat ambivalent about it because he believes in sort of the socialist project at that moment. And mm-hmm. So I think he's reflecting on all of that, right? And shifting his perspective. But I guess I would also maybe suggest that he says that they're clarified. I think that they're actually making things muddier. Right? Like, I think that after the war, because of the magnitude, the overwhelming magnitude of industrialized mass murder, right? I mean, it was just kind of overwhelming to thinkers and writers, right? And that's, we see widespread, right, among people. And so for him, it's clarifying. But I think when we actually look at them, there's actually a lot more that is generative in a specific way in his earlier columns. Even if he doesn't have the full picture, they may be empirically inaccurate, right? They open up more possibilities for us than this kind of post-war clarification of actually, like, all of things are this one big world problem.
So again, I want to thank both of you, Ben and Amelia, for a really fantastic conversation, and thank you all of you who have joined us. Thank you
so much.
Thank you, Magda.